That's not the case
he
at
says,
all.
He says, I never did that,
Yeah.
right? So,
well, the president, as the chief executive, certainly has the right to fire Rod Rosenstein, particularly if he can fire him for cause. So if, in fact, which we do not know, if, in fact, Rod Rosenstein did say that he was considering taping the president, and it was not something said in jest, which, by the way, even if said in jest, would have been a pretty foolish thing to do, the reality of the situation is that that would be considered for cause. Now, before we go too far afield, we have to remember that Rod Rosenstein may be walking over to the White House and not necessarily going in to actually resign. We don't know that yet. Axios has reported it. It does not yet know. We don't know that it has yet been confirmed. We'll wait and see. Paula Reid is working on it right now. But the reality, too, is, remember, President Trump is not right now down the street from where we are.
Right.
He is in New York. So if Rod Rosenstein is going over to the White House, I assume that he would be going over to speak with John Kelly,
right,
as the chief of staff. A lot of times these are conversations. But ultimately, why wouldn't Rod Rosenstein wait to be fired? Why would you resign?
You know, the other thing.
What is the answer to that question?
I haven't the faintest idea.
Right.
I would wait to be fired. But just like Preet Bharara was the one U.S. attorney who waited and said, "Come and get me."
Come and get me. Right. You know, and I think the other sort of question that I think a lot of people are going to have is, how often does the president and his surrogates say the New York Times is fake, the New York Times has phony sources, the New York Times isn't being truthful, and yet if the president is going by the reporting in the New York Times, it sort of lends itself to the idea that the media and the press is only viable to this administration when it suits their interests, and when it doesn't, it's all fake news. If the Deputy Attorney General, who has denied the allegations in the New York Times, he didn't call it fake news, but he says it didn't happen, then why would the president, in this particular case, believe the New York Times, and in all the other instances of the New York Times reporting say fake news?
Well, what a rational assessment, Brad. The reality is that there are those of us, perhaps including the President of the United States, who decide to read all of what an article or a news report says and believe all of it, none of it, or some of it. But in this particular case, it certainly sounds like the initial story from the New York Times has been criticized by very many other media outlets. But whether or not you say something in jest, or whether or not you were serious, and there seems to be a dispute amongst the people in the room.
Right.
About what Rod Rosenstein actually said and what he meant when he said it. Keep in mind, the person who wrote the memo about what was said in the room was Andrew McCabe.
Right.
Andrew McCabe has been subsequently let go and is under investigation. And so you have a lot of things underneath this. The difficulty, I think, that people feel is this. If you're Rod Rosenstein, would you avoid the constitutional crisis by going forward and offering to resign? Would you create the constitutional crisis, and I say that in quotes, by making the president fire you when the president does have the right to fire you for cause?
Sure.
What is the ultimate fallout? Well, of course, what many people would be concerned about is the investigation by the special counsel, Robert Mueller. If Rod Rosenstein goes, does it mean then that Mueller is on the chopping block, that the investigation will close down? I mean, that's 5 steps down the road.
Right.
Someone else would be put in Rod Rosenstein's place, and that person would certainly have the right to let Robert Mueller finish his investigation, which one would think would be done fairly soon. I think that the only endpoint we can look at right now is it is said that Michael Flynn will get sentenced on December 18th. So it seems to me that the Mueller investigation is at least open till December 18th. That's a long time from now.
Right. So if the Deputy Attorney General is fired or if he resigns, who then becomes responsible for Robert Mueller, the special counsel investigation?
Well, as I understand it, and I'm going to continue to research it, as I understand it, there is no direct line of succession that the president has to follow here. I think that because Attorney General Sessions has recused himself
that's why we're here, right? So we should point out to our viewers, the reason why the Deputy AG is in charge of the Special Counsel investigation is because normally it would be the Attorney General.
No question.
And because Jeff Sessions recused himself, it fell to into Rosenstein's lap.
Exactly correct. Now, ordinarily, you would have the Attorney General who is looking to appoint his deputies. But as I understand it, and this is a cursory reading, so I don't want to hold fast to this until I really research it more thoroughly. As I understand it, the president does have the right to appoint someone to be in that position. So if that is indeed correct, then there are a myriad of choices here.
So does the person appointed have to be part of the Justice Department?
What I read quickly on my way flying down the stairs to you is that the person must have already been confirmed. So there's a whole group of people that fall into that category. But as we continue, I will continue to research. And at the same time, Paula Reid is going off to do a special report, which will be on the air, and she's probably going to research this as well.
I mean, and this is all against the backdrop of what's playing out in the United States Senate with the president. You heard earlier this morning making his way to the UN General Assembly, sticking hard and fast with his nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court. This is all playing out against that and the fact that you have, every world leader here in New York City for a series of meetings at the United Nations. There's just a lot going on, and it's hard. To me, and again, as somebody who's not in politics, if you're just the average person on the street, you're watching what's happening here, and you're saying, even if the president is justified in getting rid of the Deputy Attorney General, is this the right time to do it?
Well, that is a really good question because of the looming midterms.
Right.
So is this the right time? That's a calculus.
I mean, everybody was saying, look, Sessions could be in trouble after the midterms, depending on how it all plays out. And so you would assume that if the Attorney General is on the chopping block, then perhaps the Deputy AG, the president just cleans house, right, after the midterms. So why make a move now? Well,
that may be a very true statement. But if it's precipitated by Rod Rosenstein walking over to the White House, which we are speculating about, that if it's precipitated that by his walking over to the White House to, in fact, have a conversation with the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, about the possibility of resignation rather than the fact of resignation, this is a factor that, of all people, John Kelly has to take into consideration in a calculus. And it's ironic, isn't it? Or is it by design that Rod Rosenstein would wake up on Monday morning, decide to make the trek to talk to John Kelly, if that's what's happening, when the president is engaged in the UN General Assembly, where once again in the world of foreign policy, we have to watch what the president is ultimately going to say to the leaders of other foreign nations. So it's an odd time, or is it an odd time?
Remember, we've heard that the president, despite his sort of signature line, "You're fired" from his show, in fact doesn't like firing people. So, why not get someone else to do it while you're out of town?
But this is,
Could be too simplistic.
Where you started with me when I took this chair just now is actually really a very important consideration. If you have the Deputy Attorney General, whether or not he's in charge of the Mueller investigation, he's still in a powerful position, period. If he was, in fact, talking about the 25th Amendment, let alone the fact of taping the president, that certainly gives reason to say is for cause.
Completely.
It's very different than Rod Rosenstein perhaps saying to Andrew McCabe, "What do you want me to do, Andy? Wear a wire," which is very sarcastic. Rod Rosenstein has a bit of a quirky personality. When you talk with him in a social situation, he does crack these odd kind of jokes or sarcastic jokes. So this would not be unheard of in how he interacts with people. It's just a very dangerous thing to do.
So there was an interview that the president did with Geraldo Rivera of Fox News, and Geraldo asked the president about Rod Rosenstein and the reporting in the New York Times, and the president basically sort of didn't give away his cards. He essentially said, that he hasn't listened, he hasn't heard everything yet. He's still weighing what to do. He points out that Rod Rosenstein was hired by Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions recused himself. And so the president is pretty much up until this point, although yes, he's been a little active on Twitter and he's called out Rosenstein and others on Twitter. He calls out a lot of people on Twitter, and sometimes nothing ever happens because of the tweets that he launches. And so we really, as you say, Ricky, we don't know. We're speculating as to whether he's resigning or whether he's going to be fired, or whether it's a combination of, you're fired, well, you can't quit, you can't fire me because I quit.
Right.
Like, we don't know.
Just reading a little bit of what the president had to say in response to the New York Times article and Rod Rosenstein. It's vague, right? But he says, well, I think it's a very sad story, and people are obviously are looking into it. It's a very sad state of affairs when something like that can happen. So I don't know if it's the story or the content of the story. If he's acknowledging that he believes the content of the story is truthful.
And also, the president's usual words are, "We'll see what happens."
That is his favorite closing line. Yes.
Yeah. And again, look, we're still trying to lock this down, and we're going to know very, very soon, because as we've been saying, the deputy AG is on his way to the White House. But while we're trying to sort of nail this down, let's talk a little bit about this Brett Kavanaugh nominee, this situation, because it is playing out against all of the backdrop of what we're talking about here. And can we, can you just, with your experience, Ricky, do you think that this hearing is going to happen on Thursday?
At the present second, yes.
You do?
Ask me again at 3 or 4 o'clock.
Right.
I think that this is, the Kavanaugh situation is right now fraught with peril. You have a second accuser. Michael Avenatti says that he has a third accuser. He's going to announce that. Michael Avenatti, as he puts it, and I think he put it in Twitter, once again, he doesn't bluff.
Right, we were saying that earlier. We know that he likes being on television, and he comes on our air, quite often, as well as a lot of other people's broadcasts, but he's never not produced what he says that he has. Absolutely
correct. And so we know that he has a third accuser. We don't know what the circumstances are, except that it was, again, when Brett Kavanaugh was young. Whether he was a teenager or in college, we don't know exactly, but in that youthful time. The difficulty is this. This has to weigh heavily not only on Brett Kavanaugh, but it also has to weigh heavily on Donald Trump and the White House and people who are in charge of going forward and helping Brett Kavanaugh through these hearings. There comes a point where somebody has to make an assessment of if it's worth all this. That there is a list that the Federal Society, a conservative group, put together for President Donald Trump of many, many well-qualified jurists who are conservatives. So it's not like the president has to start again and do a search. He has the names for the search. He has talked to people at the time of the Neil Gorsuch nomination, and again at the time of the Kavanaugh nomination. There are other people that he could quickly put into Brett Kavanaugh's shoes and have them go forth as a nominee. Now, what this creates, obviously, is the problem that if there is a new nominee, then do you know how long does the clock get stalled? Many of the prospective nominees, in fact, if not all, are already judges on United States courts who have gone through confirmation hearings. So all their file has to do is be updated. It's not like we have to start from scratch here. The Democrat-Republican dilemma is, of course, the Democrats would like to delay until after the November elections. The Republicans would like to march forward. The problem with the Republicans marching forward, Mitch McConnell is abundantly clear that he wants this vote, is that will this person, this justice, be tainted forevermore as the possible alleged sexual assaulter and someone who had a an inappropriate background when they were a teenager, even though they've had decades of exemplary conduct, at least to our knowledge, in the same way that people still look at Clarence Thomas back from the Anita Hill days. But Clarence Thomas has been on the court for all of this time, and for many people, especially of a conservative background, they feel he's a very, very effective jurist.
What he did have, though, was an FBI investigation into those accusations.
Very fair enough.
And, you know, it's also sort of at different times, I think, we're sort of hypersensitive to how political things have gotten. And, you know, just reading sort of a portion of the Geraldo interview where the president is asked about Kavanaugh, and he, you know, once again asserts his support for him, but once again says that, you know, Dr. Ford will have time to tell her story. And he says, you know, we'll listen to Brett, we'll listen to Dr. Ford, and then he says, you're going to vote the way you have to vote as a Republican and as a Democrat. And to you know, I'd like to hear that portion of the interview, but that's the other thing that's going to be following him, that if he becomes a Supreme Court justice, that part of it is just, well, it didn't really matter what came up, because Republicans and Democrats are only going to vote a certain way because we're living in very politically charged times.
Well, tell that to Senator Collins. Tell that to Senator Murkowski.
Right.
So it's, you know, this is a very thin majority in the Senate at this point in time. When you have one of the things, as I assessed, as someone who has prosecuted and defended sexual assault cases, but spent years prosecuting them, and also sat on the board of the Rape Treatment Center of UCLA Los Angeles for 7 years, is that when Dr. Ford, from news accounts, because we haven't heard her, Dr. Ford sounds like, to me, a credible individual, and that she certainly believes that everything she says is true, that she has passed a polygraph from a former FBI examiner, and that there are things in her life that corroborate her story, her leaving the East Coast for the West Coast, her deciding to become someone who works with people in trauma, her difficulties in expressing all of this, her deciding to tell her husband and the therapist in 2012, long before, this is during Obama's time, long before Brett Kavanaugh was a name that ever came out to the public. So you have a lot of indicia, even though there's no one else in the room except Mark Judge, who is not testifying because the Senate has decided not to call him. He's the third guy in the room. But even that's an indicia of credibility, that she names a third person in the room. So what you have is a potentially credible story. She could fall apart on Thursday if there's a hearing. But now you wondered, why aren't there more?
That's the question that a lot of people are having, and we'll have to see how it all plays out. Again, if you're just joining us, we're going to take a quick break, but the news that is rocking the political world right now is Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is on his way to the White House. Early reports were that he had verbally resigned to Chief of Staff John Kelly. Now the reporting is that he expects to be fired. The president is here in New York City. Rosenstein is on his way to the White House. We're going to keep an eye out on that. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
The winds are ferocious, gusting above 120 miles per hour.
The island is still struggling to recover. And many are wondering if it ever will. Puerto Rico is in the throes of an exodus that's draining the island of its most valuable resource, its people.
The most obvious sign of exodus is the number of schools that have been shut down across the island.
Pues dejo mis papás, mis hermanos, mis amistades más cercanas. Te quiero mucho.
The magnitude of Maria was something that was really hard to plan for. I will die trying to make sure that Puerto Rico becomes a place where we can have opportunity.
Toda puerta que Dios abra, yo cruzo. Por ahora, pues, todas las puertas se me están abriendo allá.
All right, if you're just joining us, there are reports, and we stress these are reports, that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, has verbally resigned to White House Chief of Staff John Kelly in anticipation of being fired by President Trump. CBS News has not confirmed this, but a source tells CBS News that Rosenstein, as we pointed out, is on his way to the White House right now, and that live shot is just the entrance into the White House.
All right, where we expect him to be walking into the White House when he arrives. Rosenstein oversees the special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, and Axios cites a source close to Rosenstein who says that the Deputy Attorney General is expecting to be fired. A source has told CBS News that Rosenstein is headed to the White House right now.
All right, we have CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman and CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns here to talk us through this. So, Caitlin, let's get to you first. I think the question we were all sort of talking about is the distinction between being fired and resigning and what that means for the Department of Justice, and ultimately what it means for the special counsel investigation, which Rosenstein now oversees.
Right. This will be a distinction that we're keeping a close eye on, because if Rosenstein does in fact resign, that would let the president appoint someone to fill that position. If he is fired, it is our understanding that the natural succession process would take place. That's significant because, remember, the president does not like this investigation, to say the least. There have been many questions about whether he would fire Attorney General Jeff Sessions in order to end the Mueller probe. Firing Rosenstein could set that into effect because Rosenstein, of course, oversees the Mueller probe. And there is a question of whether he would appoint someone in there to kind of do his bidding as it relates to the investigation. Another question I have is, after we find out what exactly is going on here, if Rosenstein is in fact out, what that would prompt lawmakers in Congress to do, in the Senate especially, because leading up to all of this, we've had lots of concerns from Republican lawmakers about protecting the Mueller probe, but none have gone so far as to actually get legislation onto the floor and build that into a real protection here, just given that lots of lawmakers said this would never happen. So a couple of different dynamics going on here. The reporting is still going on, but those are some things to consider.
And like I said earlier, all of this happening with sort of the looming midterm elections, and you have to wonder about how it's going to perceive whether it's a firing or a resignation. I mean, at the end of the day, the president has been very vocal when it comes to criticizing Rod Rosenstein, and anyone sort of keeping track of it would know the president, he's not his favorite guy.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting about this, too, is that I've been thinking about, and we've been talking kind of in the newsroom about what the strategy would be here, especially with the midterms coming up. But also, remember, they're in the middle of the Kavanaugh battle. Right. And for a lot of Democrats who were concerned about Kavanaugh before this, the question that they raised was related to the Mueller probe, insofar as, giving light to Kavanaugh's past statements in which he said that a president under investigation couldn't be criminally prosecuted. That was, at the center of Democrats' arguments against Kavanaugh, months ago when he was first announced. So kind of bringing this all to a point here raises so many questions if, in fact, Rosenstein is on his way out. Why now, and what does this do to the Supreme Court?
Ricky, you've been looking into what happens next.
So in the line of succession, the Solicitor General takes over.
That's Noah Francisco.
That's Noah Francisco, whose politics are very much in line with Donald Trump's. However, Donald Trump, this is what I'm reading, it might be able to appoint a temporary replacement to Rod Rosenstein on an acting basis for up to 210 days. So that person, as I thought before, has to have previously passed a Senate confirmation for another post or be a senior official from a relevant department. So the president's in the catbird seat either way.
That is so interesting.
It is. And stand by, Ricky and Caitlin, because we want to go to Ed O'Keefe, who is standing by right now, joining us from the White House. Ed, what are you hearing from your sources, and what are you hearing about what is potentially happening behind those closed doors behind you there in the West Wing?
You've heard the reporting, you've seen the reporting that Rosenstein is expected to get here to the White House at some point for meetings with various officials, and that's all we really know at this point. White House is otherwise dormant today with most of the action up in New York for the United Nations General Assembly meetings. You're looking at what is essentially the western entrance to the West Wing on what's called West Executive Drive, a driveway that runs north and south on just to the again, the west of the West Wing, and that is where usually government officials, other visitors who aren't necessarily heads of state or others making visits to the West Wing will arrive. And so all of us have cameras pre-positioned on that entrance to catch people who visit, especially if they're trying to do so discreetly. But as of yet, our team here has not seen Rosenstein enter. That doesn't mean he isn't here, though, because there are other ways to get in. But again, the reporting is that he's en route here for discussions about his fate, whether he's resigning, whether he's going to tell them that they need to fire him. That's still being sorted out. And we've seen this chicken and egg before with other cabinet secretaries who got caught up with problems. Most recently, the former VA secretary, Shulkin, was going back and forth with the White House over whether he was quitting or whether he was being fired. This is a far more grave situation, of course. And I can tell you, down at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue at the Capitol, they're sort of awaiting word on this with pins and needles, because this is something that's been anticipated in many ways now for more than a year. Rosenstein, of course, oversees the special counsel investigation, and there's been concern among Democrats and Republicans that were the president to remove Rosenstein or attempt to remove Robert Mueller, you might see a real vulnerability over the special counsel investigation. And so there is legislation out there that is supported by Democrats and Republicans, mostly in the Senate, that would, in essence, put in protections for the special counsel. And many have said, look, we should be doing this now in advance of any potential upending like what we may see here today. Others have said, no, that won't be necessary, or maybe we'll do it if, in fact, the president starts to make some line changes at the Justice Department. So the political response to this, coupled with what's going on, of course, with the Supreme Court nominee, has the potential to make this a really explosive day here in Washington, at least from a political standpoint. And so we're all monitoring this to wait and see what happens. With the president in New York, though, and Rosenstein here, the likelihood of an in-person meeting, of course, is not expected. And so we'll just have to wait and see how exactly this might transpire. The early reporting is that Rosenstein essentially verbally resigned to the White House Chief of Staff. We at CBS haven't entirely firmed that up, so we should be cautious about it. But certainly the fate of the Deputy Attorney General is now in question.
So, Ed, this comes on the heels of that New York Times reporting that Rod Rosenstein discussed invoking the 25th Amendment last year. Do we know how the president felt about that report, whether he thought the failing New York Times got it wrong again, or if it was something that he was taking very seriously?
Well, there was an interview this morning that aired with Geraldo Rivera, of course, the Fox News personality who also hosts a radio show. And he was, I believe, asked about it. And he said, well, I think it's a very sad story. And people are obviously, we are looking into it, but it's a very sad state of affairs when something like that can happen, referring to the possibility that Rosenstein was talking, whether seriously or in a joking manner, about invoking the 25th Amendment and removing the president. He was asked by Geraldo whether he would fire Rosenstein, and the president said, quote, I don't want to comment on it. I don't want to comment on it until I get all the facts. I haven't gotten all the facts, but certainly it's being looked at in terms of what took place, if anything took place, and I'll make a determination sometime later. So what this meeting today here could actually be is an attempt by the White House Chief of Staff on behalf of the president to get all the facts. And if Rosenstein is already signaling that he's ready to go if the president wants him to, maybe that's it. But there could also be a discussion about possibly letting Rosenstein hold on if he provides some kind of an explanation.
All right, so just to share with our viewers, Paula Reid is also reporting this out for us. And so the question that has been on a lot of people's minds right now, Ed and Caitlin and Ricky, is if Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein goes, what happens to the Mueller probe? According to Paula, this is expected to pass to the Solicitor General unless the president wants to try to use what is called the Vacancies Reform Act in this very unusual circumstance. And so the questions, of course, are for people who are not familiar with what the Vacancies Reform Act is, what is it, and what does it mean, and what kind of process would expect to play out? I don't know who wants to take that question. Yes, Ed.
So the Solicitor General right now is a guy named Noel Francisco. He's a 49-year-old former attorney at Jones Day here in Washington. If the normal line of succession were to be followed, in essence, he's the third-ranking Justice Department official. So conceivably or by default, the special counsel investigation could fall to him. It'll depend on who the Attorney General appoints, even in a temporary capacity, to be his number two. So were it to be Noel Francisco, the Solicitor General, it would be him. It could also be a guy named, let me pull it up here again, sorry, Stephen Engel, who's head of the Office of Legal Counsel. He's a former Assistant Attorney General. And like you said, the president could conceivably try to put in somebody else on a temporary basis, which would eventually require Senate confirmation of that position. But by default, at least, it would be this guy, Noel Francisco, 49-year-old. He's actually the first Asian American to hold the position and has been involved in some of the more contentious political legal battles of the last few years. He was involved, ironically, in a case involving recess appointments during the Obama administration and a case involving some of the religious freedom aspects of the Affordable Care Act. So a Republican legal foot soldier, if you will, now serving in a senior position, would conceivably fall to him unless the Attorney General and the President try to put somebody else in charge.
And so I had asked earlier, does the person who's appointed, do they have to be part of the Justice Department? I mean, could the President, even though the President wouldn't be officially appointing someone, but could he sort of pick someone from anywhere? Maybe, you know, he has a...
From the United States Senate, for example.
But he also has a proclivity for sort of picking people that he likes and knows and captains of industry and his pals. I mean, could he do something like that?
Let me ask you this, Ed, to game this out. Look, there's a lot of reporting out there that the president at some point will... you know, and this is speculation, but it's been widely reported that the president may at some point after the midterm elections decide to get rid of the attorney general. If you know that there are people, and it's also been reported, that are angling to be the next attorney general, and some of those people are currently United States senators, could a United States senator be the deputy AG and wait for that moment when the president decides to get rid of the AG?
They could be, but whether that person could be confirmed either before the end of the calendar year or in a slightly different looking Senate next year after the elections is unclear. And so I think, you know, this reporting, this moment comes at a real tricky time for the White House, because you're right. There's been plenty of chatter about Jeff Sessions going at the top of Justice Department and the possibility of having to find somebody else. If Rosenstein goes too, then you're going to potentially create a huge leadership vacuum for somebody to fill. And who exactly that could be in a situation where the Senate is just as divided, or if it flips and Democrats have narrow control, remains uncertain. And so that just creates a lot of consternation for folks, not only at Main Justice down the street here, but also on Capitol Hill and here at the White House. Because remember, the Justice Department isn't just focused on this special counsel investigation, it's focused on all sorts of matters. And a real vacuum at the top could cause real problems across the entire department, across the country.
Just to remind everybody what's going on, what we're watching for, why you're seeing this shot of a parking lot here. We're expecting Rod Rosenstein to be coming to the White House. It looks like there was some video earlier where he had gotten into a car and was heading that way. The reporting is initially from Axios was that he, according to their reporting, not CBS reporting, CBS hasn't confirmed this, that he offered to resign to the White House Chief of Staff, and that he is going to the White House now, presumably to discuss something along those lines, whether he's going to be fired or whether he's going to offer officially his resignation. We don't know, but we know that he's going to the White House. The president is not there. The president is here in New York City at the United Nations. So presumably he'd be talking to the White House chief of staff. And the question sort of moving forward is, if he is removed, many questions. What does that mean for the Mueller investigation?
Well,
go ahead. What were you going to say?
One person who has a point of view about that is Andrew McCabe. Andrew McCabe has just released a statement. You asked the question, what happens to the Russia probe? He says this in a statement: "There is nothing more important," this is a quote, "there is nothing more important to the integrity of law enforcement and the rule of law protecting the investigation of the special counsel Robert Mueller. I sacrificed personally and professionally to help put the investigation on a proper course and subsequently made every effort to protect it. To be clear, I had no role in providing information of any kind to the media stories about events following Director Comey's firing. If the rumors of the Deputy AG Rosenstein's departure are true, I'm deeply concerned that it puts that investigation at risk." And so, to Ed's point, Caitlin, you've covered politics for a long time. Ricky Kleeman is also here. Caitlin, given where Noel Francisco is, politically speaking, would this, if this is true, if Rosenstein goes, put the investigation at risk if Francisco, for example, becomes the deputy AG?
Well, certainly that is the big question. And remember, let's take a step back and remember why we're in this place and wondering what is going on here with Rosenstein. And in the New York Times reporting released on Friday, it was reported that Rosenstein had talked about invoking the 25th Amendment against the president, had talked about wearing a wire in conversations with the president. There were lots of questions about that reporting, also reflected in the Washington Post reporting about whether he was being sarcastic in those conversations and whether this information was in fact coming from the memos written by Andrew McCabe and released by Andrew McCabe. So that's kind of just tying all these points together here. Politically speaking, the question of the Mueller probe is front and center of campaigns in this election process, because you have started to hear a lot from Republicans evoking the president's own language as it relates to the Mueller probe. You've heard Republican candidates start to call this a witch hunt. You have a small group in the House of Representatives who have been on the president's side and have had tried to file letters to impeach Rod Rosenstein. So the president does have some support among Republicans a little bit here. Democrats, of course, have raised this concern over and over and over again. They've called for legislation to be brought to the floor and voted on to add legal legislative protections for the Mueller probe. So a lot of moving parts here, certainly. But remember, we're just 5 or so weeks away from the midterm elections, and what this could prompt the president to do, what this would prompt lawmakers to do, and how voters react, I think, is top of mind as well.
All right, just stand by, because we're adding to the mix, and we've got Errol Barnett on the telephone. And I know, sorry, Anne-Marie, I thought you were pointing to Andrew McCabe's statement, and I said we need. They were yelling at me to get to Errol. So Errol, you're joining us on the phone also to provide some context to the 25th Amendment, which for our viewers, if the talk of the 25th Amendment has been in discussion for some time right now. That is an amendment in the Constitution of the United States that provides the vice president and the majority of the president's cabinet to remove the president of the United States if he's unable, and this is quoting, if I recall my civics class, if he's unable to perform the duties of the president.
That's correct, Vlad and Anne-Marie. And so we just spoke to two members, or really there were three members of the president's cabinet, speaking to reporters just a few moments ago next to the UN as they try to outline the president's priorities this week at the UN General Assembly. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said it was a ludicrous question to ask him if there were any conversations that he is aware of invoking the 25th Amendment. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley effectively had the same response, saying that in no way, shape, or form has she been a part of those conversations or been aware of other people having those conversations. So as you talk about Republican candidates mirroring the president's language, you have now his cabinet one by one coming out to say, as far as they are aware, they were not part of any chat about removing President Trump from office because of a perceived inability to conduct conduct the business of the country. But what this underscores, Vlad and Anne-Marie, is that you effectively have this turmoil in the White House with President Trump and the Deputy Attorney General of the Justice Department taking place at precisely the time President Trump and his cabinet is trying to use the platform of hosting the UN General Assembly to further American interests. And there is a risk at this moment that whatever happens with the Deputy Attorney General will overshadow the next 48 hours, which will find President Trump addressing the UN General Assembly to set out his priorities, and the president will chair on Wednesday a UN Security Council briefing, which will focus on nuclear non-proliferation and Iran. So you have the major business of the country taking place as the president and his diplomatic team try and convince the rest of the world to cooperate on U.S. priorities, taking place at a time that the president effectively appears weaker at home with this instability as it relates to the Deputy Attorney General. But two members of his cabinet moments ago saying the discussions of invoking the 25th Amendment are ludicrous, and that as far as they are aware, those conversations have not taken place.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, Errol. You know, this would have been at the UN an opportunity for the president to at least talk about some of the successes he's had, whatever you want to make of what's going on with North Korea. Certainly between North and South Korea, there is progress. And you know, sort of in the shadow of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, it's sort of, you know, disintegrating into a mess. And it was an opportunity for the president to look, if you will, presidential in front of other world leaders. And now, once again, we're distracted, sort of almost twofold. We're distracted by the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, and now this sort of bombshell that Rod Rosenstein is heading to the White House. You know, Caitlin, I want to ask you what you make of that. This would have been sort of a good day for the president.
Sure. Well, it's also significant that he's not at the White House. And so if this were, you know, he's having conversations with John Kelly, if he's in fact going to have conversations with John Kelly, and what the president's conversations with John Kelly have been, you know, remain to be seen. Also, we have to consider, too, that, you know, there were a lot of questions raised about Rod Rosenstein after the New York Times and Washington Post reporting about kind of, you know, these claims that he had made. Would he be, you know, called into Congress to have to testify in front of Congress? You know, there were a lot of, you know, members of the House who certainly would want to hear from him after that New York Times reporting. And you saw a lot of the president's allies seize on that reporting. And we were wondering kind of what that would prompt the president to do. We heard from people like Sean Hannity, of course, the Fox News cable host, who is very close with the president, has the president's ear, is considered an informal advisor to him, saying the president should not fire Rod Rosenstein. And that was pretty significant because that seemed to signal the political consequences of doing so would be very stark, even for the president's own defenders here. So a lot of, you know, ongoing questions.
I mean, you know, the idea of the no Francisco, I keep going back to that, because if the point is to get rid of Rosenstein because the president wants to wrap up this investigation, Ricky, Sean Hannity's point is the one that we were making earlier. The president, he actually cautioned on the air, because the president watches Fox News, that don't do this. It's a trap, because if you do this, this gives your enemies the opportunity to say you're trying to obstruct justice, and that could be perilous.
Well, it certainly could be perilous if there were no cause, quote unquote, cause to fire Rod Rosenstein. But
you know, before Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, was quoted by NBC News as having called the president a moron, and we went weeks, months before we saw him leave. I mean, if cause is just talking about doing something, is that enough? Well, it may or may not be enough, but the reality is this. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Noel Francisco, should this all come to pass, winds up assuming the role. It is now September 24th. The midterms are in the beginning of November. Does Noel Francisco or anyone sitting in his place
want to precipitate the kind of crisis that would be precipitated nationally on the eve of the midterms. And the answer to that is no.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, regardless of how he feels about the investigation or how the president feels about it, what the words that have been used is, if McCabe goes, constitutional crisis. That's what has been, constitutional crisis, because now what does Congress do? You've pointed out, Caitlin, that there is legislation that has been crafted to protect the special counsel, and it's never been voted on.
And you meant Robert Mueller.
Sorry, what did I say?
You McCabe. He's already gone.
Too many names to keep track of here. And remember, we've been talking a lot about, what the stakes are in terms of the midterm elections. Remember, the Senate was supposed to be a very favorable environment for Republicans, just looking at the map and where the competitive races are. If something happens with Rosenstein, does that throw more races in flux, and perhaps Democrats could increase their numbers? The president is advisors and Republican strategists say that the president should be concerned about the midterms, not just because of his party in power, but the idea of impeachment, possible impeachment. You've been hearing the president talk about impeachment. You've been hearing Republican candidates talk about the specter of impeachment, trying to gin up their base to say, if you elect Democrats, they will move to impeach the president. And so that has also kind of a factor here. You did hear from a lot of Republicans, though, and Ed mentioned, for the past year or so, Republicans have been raising concerns about the president's involvement in the Mueller probe, that he should just let them play out. You've heard from investigators on the committee, Republicans saying the same thing. So they are very aware. Republicans in Congress are very aware of the stakes here.
Could whoever takes over for Rod Rosenstein, if they choose not to sort of dissolve the Mueller investigation, could they recraft the parameters or put a deadline on the investigation? Ricky, you talked about we've got a couple of things sort of in the pipeline, a couple of sentencing and so there's like 3 different things going on.
Well, you have Michael Cohen out of the Southern District. You've got Michael Flynn, who certainly is under Mueller's probe.
And then Manafort.
And Manafort.
Right.
So you do have 3 things in the mix. You also have, I think, the specter of 2 other things, one in the Congress and one in Mueller's office. In the Congress, I mean, for heaven's sake, it is now September of 2018. They have been sitting on this whole idea of having to pass legislation to protect the Mueller investigation or not. They have not done that because, of course, it wasn't necessary to have to do that. Well, maybe it was. The other thing is this. We don't know. None of us know, because there is never a leak out of Robert Mueller's office. Robert Mueller's office, we don't know if they have crafted an interim report. We don't know if they have looked at Russia collusion and they've been reworking a report as time goes on. Same thing with obstruction. So if things start to get dicey, I don't expect Mueller to have to suddenly go become a Scrivener and start from scratch. This is a work in progress. You add to it. It would be the same way as I would do legal research, that you write as you go and you add to it. So it is always possible that under the gun they would have to issue a report faster, sooner rather than later.
So we've just sort of been handed just a little response. Now we're sort of seeing how people have been responding in sort of hindsight. Right. But Representative Trey Gowdy was on with John Dickerson. John Dickerson asked him about, about this reporting, about the 25th Amendment and what he would expect from Rod Rosenstein. And he basically says that, Rod deserves the right to be heard. And he says, I'm sure at some point the president will bring Rod in and say, Rod, if you think I'm incompetent, if you feel the need to wear a wire when you're talking with me, then why are you serving in my administration? Which goes back to sort of the having cause to get rid of somebody, right?
Well, it also goes back to the fact that you're assuming, or Trey Gowdy is assuming, a rather rational conversation in a very irrational moment.
The other thing is the backdrop of this Supreme Court nominee, because when we use the words constitutional crisis, on one hand, if you're a Republican and you're part of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you need Brett Kavanaugh to be the next Supreme Court, because he is on the record about how he feels around investigations of the office of the President of the United States, right,
yes,
Kaylin?
Which was the center of Democrats' arguments against him going into all of this.
Right, but on the other hand, you have these very serious allegations against the nominee, which could, look, college-educated women, Mitch McConnell can read the tea leaves. He knows better than anybody. It's always been said about Mitch McConnell, he's not going to put members of his party at risk for taking, if they have to take a vote that is not going to go the way that he expects it to go. Could he in this?
Well, what's really interesting here is to assess the relationship that the president has with members of his own party in the Senate, many of whom don't feel an allegiance to him and are retiring. Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, of course, are going to be key votes. We've also been focusing on Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, two swing votes in the Senate, Republicans who also happen to be women. Whether the president's actions in terms of Rosenstein, and again, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what is happening or what those conversations are. So to be clear about that. But if something does in fact happen that removes Rosenstein and raises questions about the probe, I'm wondering if that also, brings up additional concerns for those members who were already on the fence about Kavanaugh and kind of what this all means, especially since they have not been extremely pleased with the rhetoric coming out from the president and have called for protections for this probe or just to allow it to continue.
You're talking about those swing voters, swing senators, Collins, Murkowski. Yeah, it'll be interesting. All right, let's take a quick break. We've been talking about this now for a better part of an hour. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll regroup. We'll have more information. Stick around. All right, we've got a camera trained on that parking lot right there where we expect, although we could absolutely be wrong, there are numerous entrances into the White House. But, we feel, a lot of people feel that this might be where the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, is going to appear at some point. So we've got a camera there. And this is all because of the news that was first reported by Axios, but which has been unconfirmed, really, which is that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who is in charge of the special counsel investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election, expects to be fired and had perhaps verbally or in some way communicated that he was resigning to the Chief of Staff, John Kelly. Now it's that he's on his way to the White House. That is the only thing for our viewers who are tuning in. That is the only thing we can confirm, that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, is on his way to the White House. For all I know, for all we know, he's probably there already. Maybe he's not. We don't know. But we've got Caitlin Huey-Burns here with us and Ricky Kleeman to help us sort of, wade through all the questions and all the speculation that is out there. It's interesting, Anne-Marie, before we went to break, we had a little bit, and I don't know if we have it on video, but if we do, we should get that and play that for our viewers of Trey Gowdy being interviewed by John Dickerson just yesterday on Face the Nation and talking about the allegations made in the New York Times on Friday, which is that the Deputy Attorney General at some point in the wake of the firing of James Comey made a suggestion that that he could record the president surreptitiously, or that he would try to engage other members of the president's cabinet in discussions around the 25th Amendment, which is there to remove the president of the United States if the vice president and members of the cabinet feel that the president cannot carry out his duties. So that I just laid out exactly where we are at the top of the hour for our viewers.
All that we're sort of speculating about, really. But we have Franco Ordonez. He's a White House correspondent with McClatchy News. He's on the phone with us now. So, Franco, we've been sort of talking about what this could all mean, whether a firing versus a resignation makes that much of a difference. As you hear the potential, what are some of the things that you're pondering about what the fallout might be if Rod Rosenstein leaves or if he's fired?
I mean, I think the big question is, what does this do to the Mueller investigation, of course? Rosenstein has been walking a tightrope for a long time between President Trump and the Mueller investigation. It is Mueller, after Sessions recused himself, it was Mueller who has been overseeing the Mueller investigation into questions about Russian interference in the election, Russian involvement with the Trump campaign. And as I said, he's been kind of walking the situation where he has to protect the investigation against Trump's allegations that it's a witch hunt, while at the same time he had to be careful not to defend it too much because he did not want to be in a situation where essentially he is now potentially being removed from his position. And if that's the case, someone else will come in. A new person could essentially refuse to approve Mueller's requests. In essence, it could slow down the investigation. It could bring it to a crawl, or worse, Trump, or in another situation, Trump could, it could open the door for Trump getting rid of Mueller himself.
Yeah, indeed. And as we talked before earlier, this is all happening with, the midterm elections looming. And there are sort of things that could happen as part of the line of succession, people who could take over. But then there's just the perception, how the general public feels about not just the president, but obviously Congress and the Senate and other Republicans, and whether or not they feel like there's a deliberate attempt, maybe because circumstances allowed it, to obstruct justice here. I mean, the Mueller investigation is investigating the president.
No, there's no question about it. I mean, I think a lot of that depends on what side you are on. A lot of these feelings in the public, obviously we have a very polarized country right now, and so many of these feelings are pretty baked in. If you're an ally of President Trump, you're feeling that the president is again taking some unpopular steps to, get rid of someone who has actively been working against the administration, actively working against someone who President Trump himself has questioned whether his loyalty and whether he could be trusted. But if you're on the other side, or you're someone who believes in the Mueller investigation, who feels this is right, you're feeling that this is another example of the Trump administration a bit unraveling. It's Trump at war with his own government. It's seeing how this administration has really taken apart and hurt some of the United States' biggest institutions, like the Justice Department, like the FBI, and that is very unsettling to those.
Franco. It's interesting to me now, about an hour into this, a lot of, we're in this newsroom where we can see what everybody else is doing, and it feels as if there's a slight pullback on the news. Now everybody is saying the Deputy Attorney General is just on his way to meet with the Chief of Staff, that he's been summoned to the White House. And I wonder what your sources, I mean, I know you guys sit there in the White House, and you talk to folks. I know Sarah Sanders is here in New York, but I don't know who's there today from the press office in the White House, but what are you just hearing from your sources about potentially why Rod Rosenstein is on his way to the White House, and what potentially it all means?
Well, I mean, I think similar to what you've been saying in the past. I mean, there's so much unclear right now. We've heard different things that he delivered a message to orally to John Kelly, but now there's questions about that. But he is, as you pointed out, and all these cameras are now eyeing on the White House, waiting to see if he'll walk through that screenshot. Because there's a lot of questions about whether he is going to be fired, whether he is resigning, or it's something else. But what is clear is that this has been kind of a countdown as to whether Rosenstein could survive this continued pelting from the Trump administration after that report from the New York Times, saying that he potentially was going to wear a wire, whether he was going to invoke a 25th Amendment or not, whether in jest or whether it was just, floating the idea. It certainly struck the president, and it hit a nerve that, has already been very sensitive for a long time. So, we've seen these things in the past where these rumblings in the White House start, and oftentimes they end up with a top leader leaving the White House and leaving the administration.
Caitlin, do you want to say something?
Franco, it's Caitlin Huey-Burns, and this question could be for you or for you, Ricky. Was there anything that you've been hearing in terms of that New York Times report that would suggest that Rosenstein was compromised in any way in terms of his ability to oversee the investigation, given what was in that reporting?
No. And I say that on the basis of just being a lawyer, and because we're looking at an investigation according to law. Robert Mueller still has an impeccable reputation for ethics and integrity, and that he is going forward to find the truth wherever the truth is, wherever the facts will lead him. And that Rod Rosenstein has been overseeing it, but not in the sense of in any way, quote unquote, corruptly or with corrupt intent or with just inappropriate intent in his direction of Robert Mueller.
Bear in mind, Ricky, it's a good point that you make. One of the things that was in that New York Times report is because this is all alleged to have happened in the wake of the firing of James Comey. And let's go back to that. The president had Rod Rosenstein write a letter suggesting these are the reasons why I'm firing James Comey. Then he tells Lester Holt it's because of the Russia investigation. So if you're Rod Rosenstein, you're like, you just put me out there and...
Well, there was a great deal of distress that was reported on the part of Rod Rosenstein, and from my sources in Washington, people who know Rod Rosenstein very well, that at that point he was in a great deal of turmoil, that he felt he had been middled, he felt he had been used. He did not intend, when he wrote that report, to become the whipping boy. And the result of it was that he winds up calling for the special counsel investigation and appointing Robert Mueller, which, as Steve Bannon has said, was the worst political decision in history, if I am quoting Steve Bannon correctly. So it was at a time that if, in fact, Rod Rosenstein uttered anything in words about the 25th Amendment, or if he was joking or serious about wearing a wire, and I've got to assume he was joking, which was inappropriate if he was joking, that it was at a time that emotions were running high. It's a year ago. It's more than, it's a year and a half ago.
Right. To your point about how he has conducted himself with the responsibility of being responsible for the special counsel investigation, for all extensive purposes, we don't know, but it seems that he's been incorruptible, to use your words.
I think so. Now, reasonable minds could differ, because it certainly could be said by people who believe differently than I do, as they assess Mr. Rosenstein's supervision, that they would say, well, wasn't it interesting that he decided to farm out the Cohen case to the Southern District of New York, to just push that one aside while they were working on the Manafort case? Wasn't it interesting, neutral word, for Rod Rosenstein to decide to go after Manafort's activities in lobbying and working for the pro-Russia Federation in Ukraine years before. Wasn't it interesting that there were 2 indictments of Paul Manafort? For what possible purpose except to get Manafort to flip? So there are people who might look at Rod Rosenstein's conduct as pressure, pressure, pressure against the president. I do not look at it that way, but there are others who will.
Well, that's what I kind of wanted to ask Ed O'Keefe, because I was thinking sort of along the same lines as you. You know, that if there was going to be a fracture in their relationship, it started very early on with that letter explaining, you know, why James Comey, you know, needed to be fired. And I wondered, Ed, or anyone else, if you had any familiarity with how Rod Rosenstein felt about the president, felt about the way he was being treated. I mean, it can't be easy to have these tweets go out there. He certainly seems like a very conservative guy. He's not jumping on Twitter and responding in any way.
No, he's not. And I mean, he's been asked about it a few times over the course of the last year and a half or so, and you know, hasn't tipped his hat either way. I mean, we know from reporting done by our colleagues here that obviously he's concerned about this, but is focused on keeping the special counsel investigation itself intact and in a reputable state. So for him to now feel the need to at least anticipate being fired shows you that perhaps at this point things are irreparably damaged. We're still keeping our eye on the driveway camera here, and it's not the prettiest shot. But what it does is give us a very narrow window at a staircase that leads up into the West Wing, and people who are sometimes visiting come through that door, and so all we're really able to do is read half a face or so of the people who are coming and going. But you can't pull back from that shot. You can't really pan either way, because that's the narrow view that we have from that location.
The whole world is looking at that view right now.
Caitlin, you look like you wanted to jump in a little bit before.
It's interesting because you've said, and which is absolutely true, that from Mueller's perspective, from Mueller's part, he has been absolutely silent, right? Not talking about this at all. Rosenstein has talked about this. He's given public speeches. He's been out in public. Of course, he's testified in front of Congress. And of course, he has been, because he is leading this investigation or overseeing this investigation, he has been the one that has, you know, been at the press conferences talking about the indictments pushed forward by the DOJ as a result of this probe. He has, in all of those appearances, at least to me, expressed a level of confidence in his own position and in his own a view of how the Mueller probe is going. So my question that I was kind of raising a couple of minutes ago was, you know, does the New York Times reporting change Rosenstein's own view of his effectiveness in this?
You know, the other thing that is a very good question, and I also wonder, we keep talking about what does this mean for the special counsel investigation if the Deputy Attorney General goes. Ricky, to you, there are so many investigations now being conducted. For example, the Southern District is conducting an investigation. Just because the president or one of whoever the president appoints to take the spot of the deputy AG decides to shut down the Mueller probe does not make those other investigations go away. And there may be more from other districts in the United States.
No question about it. First of all, we have 2 that are done with, in the sense that they are not going away.
And the president has no control over those.
None. And that concerns, and they're under Robert Mueller, but it makes no difference because Paul Manafort has now pleaded guilty. That's not going back.
Right.
So the only thing left for Paul Manafort to do is continue to cooperate, but they had already debriefed him for a long period of time. He's getting sentenced. I mean, I would think Paul Manafort has every reason to not want Robert Mueller to go away, because Robert Mueller has the keys to his freedom, or at least to a lesser sentence. The Southern District of New York is on its own. That's dealing with Michael Cohen and whatever falls out from that. The Attorney General's office for the state of New York has gone forward with its civil suit against the Trump Foundation, which then led to a referral, for criminal referral, to the IRS, as well as to the Federal Election Commission. So those are going forward. So no, it is not going to end. But the quote-unquote Russia collusion investigation would be the one with Robert Mueller that could go by the boards, and obstruction of justice as it concerns not only the possibility of looking at the president, but looking at the president's family. And those are, of course, the most important things to Donald Trump.
He's talked about that. He said that,
that's the red line.
Yeah. So we've got this soundbite from John Dickerson interviewing Trey Gowdy on Face the Nation yesterday. Let's play a little bit of that. And Ed, if you're still with us, I'll get you to react to what Congressman Gowdy is saying to John.
Sure.
Rod deserves the right to be heard. And I'm sure at some point the president will bring Rod in and say, Rod, if you think I am incompetent, if you feel the need to wear a wire when you're talking to me, then why are you serving in my administration? And it may be that Rod says, Mr. President, none of that happened. We won't know that until we see the McCabe memos, which if you really want to see them, don't run for Congress. Go be a reporter because they've seen them and we have not. Look at the McCabe memos, find out who else, if anyone, was in the room, and then give Rod a chance to explain whether or not it's true and the context in which it was said. But one thing is clear. Whether you're Republican or Democrat president, you have a right to a deputy attorney general that doesn't think you're incompetent and doesn't feel the need to audio tape conversations with you.
Andrew McCabe being the former deputy director of the FBI. What do you make of the president's comment about his attorney general, that when asked in an interview, he said, I don't have an attorney general? What do you make of just the general relationship between the president and the Department of Justice?
It's terrible, and it's heartbreaking, and I understand the president's frustration. The frustration is that he picked, out of all the universe of attorneys he could have picked, he picked one that had to recuse himself from that office's most significant investigation. But he did pick him, and I would prefer that they keep their differences private. There's nothing to keep the president from bringing Jeff Sessions over and having a stern conversation about priorities or policies, but the public fighting, to me, this is a different office, John. It's not the Department of Agriculture or Commerce. It's a blindfolded woman holding a set of scales that each of us has to have confidence in, and it's sad to watch, quite frankly.
All right, Ed. So, Trey Gowdy saying that the president could very well bring in, or somebody who works for the president, and say, if you think I'm incompetent and you feel the need to wear a wire, then why are you serving in my administration? Could this be that?
Could be. And it's a totally valid point. Everyone that serves in a political appointed job serves at the pleasure of the president, no matter who that president is. And should they have concerns about that president's leadership or significant disagreements or speak out publicly in such a brash way or even privately and then have it reported, then certainly, it's grounds for dismissal, and it shouldn't surprise anybody. The concern here is, as Congressman Gowdy said, of course, is that this is such a sensitive project, sensitive mission that Rosenstein has been tasked with overseeing for the past year and a half or so. And so, him going could potentially really upset the equilibrium that exists right now that allows that special counsel investigation to continue. And because there's talk about Sessions leaving, and because there's concerns in both parties about potential meddling or attempts to end the special counsel probe, and Rosenstein was seen as the guardian of it, this has a real potential to upend a lot of things. You're seeing chatter on Twitter and other places about, this could really undermine our rule of law, and it could create a new political crisis, or it's the Saturday Night Massacre in slow motion. Look, we'll see what exactly transpires here, but that's certainly a lot of the concern that people are expressing, here in Washington today, as we wait and see what exactly is transpiring here before us at the White House.
Yeah, well, the other thing that Trey Gowdy said is that, Rod Rosenstein deserves to be heard. And I wonder, what the fallout could be if the perception is that the president was just waiting for an opportunity that this New York Times article gave him to find an excuse to get rid of him. If that's the way it's perceived, could we see some Republican lawmakers pushing back in a very sort of assertive way against the president?
You could, totally, absolutely. And there have been Republicans who said it. There are Republicans who said it privately, that should something like this transpire, should there start to be a rearrangement of the deck chairs, if you will, at the Justice Department, they would express concern. They might step in with potential legislation to safeguard the special counsel. It's Republican senators like Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Bob Corker of Tennessee has been involved in those conversations. Democrats, of course, on the Judiciary Committee, like Cory Booker, Richard Blumenthal. But the key would be getting enough Republican concern and Republican support for that kind of legislation to move forward. You got to keep in mind one other thing that's going on this week here in Washington, as if we don't have enough to talk about. You have the Supreme Court nomination mess, but you also have government funding running out on Friday. And there is a real potential, if there isn't some quick agreement here, if the president doesn't put a signature to the paper that keeps the government open, that you could see some kind of an impasse related to the dismissal or the resignation of Rosenstein, just depending on how all this plays out. So that's also hanging over all of this, because the president hasn't necessarily agreed yet to sign the temporary spending agreement that was put in place. And if he rejects it for some reason, could cause great calamity and a potential shutdown. So you just throw that into the mix. And look, I realize we're in a moment here where we're speculating because we can't quite figure out what's going on behind us here. But that is that's the reality, is that this is quite fast moving. It's made more tricky today by the fact that the president is in New York and that his chief of staff and deputy attorney general are here, and that there are so many other things percolating right now here in Washington and frankly on the global stage up in New York that could complicate this even more. The president doesn't want to be seen as vulnerable in front of other world leaders this week in New York. Back here in Washington, of course, he faces other problems with the Supreme Court nomination and potential problems with the spending legislation. So all of this comes at a really tricky moment for the White House, for the Justice Department, for everyone in Washington.
You know, it's interesting, Ed, that you pointed to the Saturday Night Massacre in slow motion, which is, if my memory serves correctly, that the Saturday Night Massacre happened in October of 1973. We're just a couple of weeks away from October. And to remind our viewers, that was when the President of the United States, then Richard Nixon, decided to fire Archibald Cox. He wanted to fire Archibald Cox. He asked the Attorney General to do so. Mr. Richardson declined to do so and resigned. He then asked the Deputy Attorney General to fire Archibald Cox. He resigned. The President appointed Robert Bork, who then, did what the president wanted to. You said, Ricky, earlier that if the president, we all serve at the pleasure of the president of the United States. If there was cause, if the Saturday Night Massacre, there was no cause, is there cause here? If you're trying to relate the two?
I think that is up to debate. Yeah. And that's part of the problem. I think really that Caitlin had actually the best phrase, was when you're talking about the fact is whether or not there's real cause. What's in the mind of Rod Rosenstein about how he perceives how this is being heard in the country? And does he think that therefore that this makes him less effective? What I do see in terms of reporting, besides the fact I can see Paula out of the corner of my eye, which means I'm going to get a more definitive view, is that within minutes of each other, the Wall Street Journal was reporting that Rod Rosenstein expected to be fired and not resign, as the Washington Post was reported that he was resigning. So talk about a world of speculation. So that brings us back to cause. Is joking a cause? Or does it really mean that the president would be able to look at this and say, whether or not you were joking, which was inappropriate, or whether or not you were serious, that it makes you ineffective to have this role?
Right. All right, so we are going to continue to cover this. What you're seeing right there is a shot of the parking lot with a little, what you can't tell is that's a view of the entranceway into the White House. We are expecting that Rod Rosenstein will be going to the White House. He could be there, for all we know, but this is our best guess that if he was coming, this is where he'd be coming in and out of. The reporting is that there's a possibility that Rod Rosenstein could be fired or could resign. That's according to Axios. But you know what? There's also a possibility that he's just going to the White House to have a conversation. Yeah. Perhaps a cup of tea.
Yes.
We just don't know.
Or stern tongue lashing.
Yes. Yeah. So we're going to take a quick break and continue to cover this. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
All right, we've got a camera trained at the White House where we expect, or we hope at least, that we will see or catch a glimpse of the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who, according to all sources, is on his way to the White House. He's been summoned there. For what we do not exactly know, it's been speculated that he is either going to resign or he may be fired by the Chief of Staff, John Kelly. We don't know, but we've got Paula Reid, who's joining us here at the table, and Paula is working her sources, so you'll see her occasionally on her phone right now, working her sources. Also, Caitlin Huey-Burns is joining us if you wanted to say something.
So we have a development. We know right now that Rod Rosenstein is actually attending a previously scheduled meeting at the White House in his official capacity as Deputy Attorney General. So the question is, has he not had the big talk yet? Right. Or did they have it and things are still pending, or did they have it and it went well? So as you can see, as of right now, what we know, confirmed from sources at the Justice Department, that he went to the White House today expecting to be fired. While we haven't seen him right now, sources confirm that he is at a previously scheduled meeting in his official capacity. So that's where we are right now.
He's at the White House.
As of right now, he is at the White House in a previously scheduled meeting in his official capacity as Deputy Attorney General. So at this moment, sources within the Justice Department confirmed to me that he is still our Deputy Attorney General.
And we also know that this shot is useless to us. She had up there for like an hour.
Because did you ever really think that he was going to, with all those cameras there, that he was going to go strolling by everybody's camera and wave to the cameras as he makes his way to the
And I
White
just
House?
got some more details. Apparently it's a cabinet level meeting, and he's filling in for the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who's coming back from a speech on opioids. So he's traveling right now. So the Deputy Attorney General was filling in on behalf of the Attorney General. It's not that unusual for the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General to visit the White House. Sometimes we get real excited when people see him there and he's spotted by cameras. And I'm like, look, he's there twice a week. But today, obviously, this takes on enormous significance. But as of right now, what we can report is he's at least attending meetings in his official capacity.
So let's talk about this reporting then, that he was expecting to be fired or expecting to be let go.
Wouldn't you if you were him? You might think that you're expecting.
Yeah, one never knows with the president, not just because of the reporting that we saw, about the 25th Amendment recently, but also sort of the tweets and the increased attacks that he's been sort of enduring. So let's talk about why he would think he could get fired now.
Absolutely. I don't know if you guys have talked about this, but the president did an interview with Geraldo Rivera. It was 2 days ago, but it was before the most recent Kavanaugh news. And the president makes reference to this, but he didn't do a full-throated defense of his Deputy Attorney General. He said, look, it's a very sad state of affairs when something like that can happen. But let's circle back to what was the allegation. What did they allege happened? The New York Times reported that Rod Rosenstein suggested back in, I believe it was May of 2017, wiretapping or recording conversations with the president. Now, I talked to sources who were in this meeting. They say, yes, he did say this, but it was a joke. And anybody who talks to Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein knows he makes a lot of jokes.
Ricky Kleeman said the same thing. That he's a very sort of quirky sense of humor.
We joke and call them dad jokes, right? Whenever he's talking about something tense, he just tries to make a joke, and then he looks around to make sure everyone's comfortable and giggling along. Now, the other suggestion was that perhaps he had referenced using the 25th Amendment to oust the president. No one I've spoken with, I spoke with half a dozen sources, no one believes that is true. No one heard that being said, because what you would have to believe in order to go along with that is that Rosenstein at that point thought he could get 2/3 of Congress to oust the president. This was back in May of 2017.
In the wake of the firing of James Comey, which he attached his name to
by
that
Rod
letter.
Rosenstein and Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And here's the thing, the Times also reported that Rosenstein believed that Jeff Sessions would go along with this effort to oust the president under the 25th Amendment. Rod Rosenstein is a very smart man. He's a very careful man. It just defies logic that back in May of 2017, the Attorney General of the United States, his first senator to come out and support then candidate Donald Trump, a smart man who served in the Senate for decades, would actually believe that an effort like that would be successful. And people often ask me, why doesn't the Attorney General resign? Why is he still in office? Because even if he disagrees with the president, he believes in his platform and he believes in his agenda. And that's why he works day in and day out to execute that. So the idea that Rosenstein would have thought that Jeff Sessions would go along with the 25th Amendment, that just
And he wasn't at that point being torched by the president of the United States on a consistent basis. He was still a very strong supporter.
Nothing about that
So then to this latest reporting that Rod Rosenstein had this idea that he could be fired, does that ring true to you?
Well, the question is, why did these memos surface on Friday? where did they come from? I mean, I reported this out. I talked to half a dozen sources. Yes, some of these comments were made, but the interpretation by sources in that room was very different. But the New York Times went with them. They said that they talked to sources, anonymous sources, who believed that it was a legitimate, a serious suggestion to record the president. There were questions about where did this leak come from? And
they say, by the way, it wasn't a leak. They say they've been reporting on this, Michael Schmidt and Adam Goldsman. They say they've been reporting this for a year. So I'm just, because people have questioned their reporting. They've said.
Yeah, they've come under considerable scrutiny because this was anonymous sources. And there were a lot of people in that meeting. And it's not too hard to figure out who would have been in that meeting, who's working for Rod Rosenstein at that time, who was running the FBI at that time. Many people have these different memos. But I think a lot of people had questions about why the New York Times, two fantastic reporters, Adam Goldman and Mike Schmidt, why they would rely on anonymous sources for something that could obviously set the president off and potentially result in the firing of Rod Rosenstein. And the reporting, while the New York Times said lots of people have matched it, people, myself included, have matched that at least the wiretap comment was made, but my sources say it was made in a sarcastic tone. So for Rod Rosenstein, he may know something else about what's happening behind the scenes, and perhaps that there's a push to oust him. And maybe he just feels instead of being fired, he wants to resign. It's not clear why today.
Was there anything in that reporting that signaled to you and in your own reporting that Rod Rosenstein, you know, we've seen him make public statements, he's given speeches, he's expressed confidence in his position and in the Mueller probe itself. Was there anything in that reporting or in your reporting that signaled to you that maybe his frame of mind, maybe he felt perhaps he was compromised in terms of running this investigation, in terms of his own ability to continue to oversee this investigation? Anything that signaled that at all?
No, and so far people inside the Justice Department are all shocked.
Okay.
Really? Because he came out with an absolute unequivocal denial on Friday. He said this is absolutely not true. And he could have said no comment. He actually came out with two different statements.
One was sort of like, and then one was much strongly worded.
Absolutely, especially about the 25th Amendment issue. So it's just not clear what transpired between Friday and now to make him go to the White House believing he would be fired. Now, we may get to the end of the day and realize this was all semantics, that he had to go for this meeting and he expected to be canned after the meeting and he wasn't, and this has all just sort of gotten out of control. But what I was told from the Justice Department about 2 hours ago is that he was on his way to the White House and he expected to be fired.
I'm concerned about ourselves and our own reporting. Like, you don't want to sort of overstate anything, but it would be, a bomb if he was to resign or to be let go. And we talked about how that bomb would reverberate, not just with the Mueller investigation. Even if the Mueller investigation just keeps chugging along and is untouched, it's the perception that can be almost the most damaging, not just for the Mueller investigation and whether or not they're, behind the scenes, they're being pressured to shut it down, but also for the upcoming midterm elections and the perception of the president, who's right now at the UN trying to look presidential and trying
in front of all the world.
Right, and trying to sort of highlight some of the W's that he has, and whatever you want to say about North Korea. I think, there's definitely more progress there than we've seen in a very long time. And now there's this massive distraction that we don't even know how much substance there is to it.
Right. If you're a world leader, are you negotiating with the person who you think, because of what you see happening across your cabinet, your government every single day, that you're going to be sitting in front of in a year or two?
Right. Which was my, political interest was why now, which is why I'm interested in who started this conversation, right? Because it would not be in the political interest of the president to do this now. Not only is he appearing in front of world leaders and wanting to exert his influence on the national stage while the attention is focused on that, he's also in the middle of an excruciating Supreme Court fight with more reporting coming out yesterday, raising more questions about Kavanaugh. Very much up in the air. That is the Supreme Court is his core achievement and selling point heading into the midterm. So that's why I was wondering kind of who initiated this conversation, because certainly would not be in the interest of the president to start this now.
Paula, I know you're chatting with your sources right now, even as we're talking, but a lot of the reporting out there seems to suggest, just because of the way the president has reacted over the past couple of months, and numerous outlets have reported this, that he's, quote, at war with the Justice Department. Do the career officials that you talk to, the career men and women who serve in the Justice Department, feel that the president is at war with them?
He's certainly not supportive. And when you come out and say the FBI is in tatters, when you criticize the whole thing, on Friday I was at a speech with him in Missouri, and he just talked about a lingering stench over at the Justice Department. And of course, I know many reviewers know this, but FBI is part of the Justice Department. He routinely criticizes his own attorney general. And I think that absolutely people in the rank and file, they do not feel supported.
It's interesting to me. We had Dan Senor on here. We've had him on several times as a CBS News contributor. And I asked him if he ever thought that Republicans would be associated with attacks on the Justice Department, attacks on the FBI. There's always, many times there's a fine line where they say, well, we're not talking about the men and women on the front lines who are special agents. But is there a distinction? If you work for the FBI, you're all part of the same team, and the president says there's a lingering stench, that affects everybody.
It does affect everybody. You have to remember the day-to-day work of the FBI and federal law enforcement really isn't focused on Russia. That's a very tiny, minuscule little part of the work that they're doing day in and day out. They work to protect us from national security threats, all sorts of different threats, cyber threats. We have the threat from China. There's so many fronts that they're working on day in and day out to keep this country safe. Absolutely, they make mistakes. I think, though, you have people like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page and the text messages that they exchanged, that's a problem. And that's not a great optic for the FBI and people with a political, political skin in the game here. They seized on that, in particular the president and his allies. And they've said, look at these text messages. Can you believe the things that Peter Strzok, who was involved in the Hillary Clinton investigation and the Russia probe, is saying about the president, then candidate, and his supporters? I can tell you, I've read like 1,000 of their text messages. They didn't have anything nice to say about anybody, but you cannot discredit the fact that he was involved in these two politically sensitive investigations and saying terrible things about then candidate Trump and his supporters. You can see why some people may say, yeah, I think we should investigate that. I think we should make sure that this investigation does not actually have any sort of political bias. So it's important, to be transparent and hold the FBI to a high standard. But these continued attacks, it's not great for morale.
So we've got Ed O'Keefe, who's back in front of our camera there at the White House. And we are going to get to some other news, but we'll just ask our commentators and reporters to just sort of give us their final thoughts. Ed, have you heard from any members of Congress at all in the wake of this news from Axios?
I had checked with several, and they said they were waiting to see what exactly had transpired, whether or not Rosenstein was being dismissed or not. So given Paula's excellent reporting that Rosenstein's here for a previously scheduled affair and not to be kicked out of the administration, it would seem that all status is normal. And we'll just have to wait for another day, or at least another hour of this day, to see whether or not Rosenstein is getting dismissed.
Has anybody expressed any exhaustion? I mean, I know just sitting here at the anchor desk, it sort of feels like, what is going on over there? We can hear all sorts of sort of quirky noises back there.
It's a test of the emergency broadcast system, Anne-Marie.
Good to know that it's working.
Timing.
It's always
Absolutely perfect timing. But I was wondering if any lawmakers have just sort of expressed any exasperation that, in the middle of this Kavanaugh confirmation, which has become, quite intense and sort of bizarre in some ways, we've got this other thing popping up.
Right. Anne-Marie, I think you were saying everyone's tired, and it's only Monday. And there it goes again. This is a campus.
Okay, maybe we should pull away from Ed O'Keefe.
It's great to know that it works.
Yeah, but I feel like Ed needs to preserve his own hearing, because if it's loud to us, it must be really loud to him. So, Ed, I'm going to pivot away from you.
Here. Well, hold on. Well, I think it's over, and if it isn't, we'll blow through it. Look, yes, people are exhausted. This was a long weekend, too, remember, because you had these allegations surface against Brett Kavanaugh. You had the lingering concerns about this reporting on Friday, but this is every day now in Washington. We are all accustomed to it. Everyone over on Capitol Hill is always sort of prepared for something like this to happen. It hasn't happened, at least as of 12:38 Eastern Time, and we'll see whether it transpires later in the day. But for now, at least, we know that Rosenstein still has a job. And everything, despite that test you just heard, is status normal here at the White House.
This is not an emergency.
Yes, I sort of feel that test is a metaphor for the news media, which is we got very excited.
Worked up about something that wasn't actually happening. Yeah.
What were we going to say?
Even if Rosenstein is not fired, or even if he doesn't resign today, I think the question goes back to Capitol Hill, to lawmakers, to ask, whether they do feel more of an incentive to bring legislation to the floor to protect the probe.
That's a good point.
Because the past year, there has been talk of it, but it's always been hypothetical. And today it could very well, again, be hypothetical. But the question remains, should there be parameters put in place to ensure a protection of this probe going forward.
Well, you know, every time we sort of had a special investigation, the parameters of that have been tweaked. And so every time as we move forward, the new incarnation is really an experiment to see how it works under these new pressures, you know?
Right, and that's why there has been a lot of, you know, you've been hearing a lot from Republican allies of the president, from the president himself. You know, he calls it illegal. It's not illegal. There have been instances, and Paula can speak to this better than I can, but, you know, the concern here is that the probe does have the mandate to grow and to go wherever it may lead, wherever the investigation may lead. And that has, of course, been the overarching concern from a political front, knowing that that is possible.
Right, and that's, you know, often has been kind of a reaction to probes that were too limited in their scope and couldn't go beyond that. So now we have, you know, something that's able to sort of sprawl, and it has, I mean, in terms of the Mueller's successes thus far, have had nothing to do with collusion.
Yeah, but it's also not been a witch hunt, and that's the question that I think a lot of people are still going to have. And you raise an excellent point, Caitlin. If at every moment in time the media and others breathlessly report what is happening with the person who's responsible for the investigation, why not introduce a piece of legislation that removes that doubt and removes all questions as to whether or not it will proceed, no matter what the president tweets or what he says? And I guess finally to you, Paula, if the Deputy Attorney General resigns or is fired or something happens to him, who gets that investigation? Because and this is a question we asked Ricky Kleeman, there are other investigations, notably in the Southern District of New York, that are going to continue whether or not Robert Mueller is in his job.
That is a great question. I'm going to give you a little fresh reporting, and then we're going to get to the line of succession. I am told that prior to this meeting that Rod Rosenstein is currently in, he did meet with General Kelly to discuss his job status. Yes. So he's met with Kelly, and he is currently in a different meeting, a previously scheduled meeting, as Deputy Attorney General. And I said, well, does this mean he wasn't fired, or is it TBD? Is there like a committee meeting? And all this source would say, and this is a justice official says, he is still the Deputy Attorney General.
There you go.
So that is a good sign, but I think we can tell from this morning that his job status is perhaps not 100% secure, nor is it ever. But
check
this morning
the timestamp.
Yes, but that is the
accurate.
best information that I have right now from inside the Justice Department. Now, if Rod Rosenstein should no longer be employed by the end of the day, the big question is who takes over the special counsel investigation. And there's two schools of thought on this right now. The one is that you go through the line of succession at the Justice Department. There's always a concern an official could die, or we recently had the number 3 person go work for Walmart. Who takes over for them? Right now, in the line of succession, it would fall to the Solicitor General, Noel Francisco. Part of the problem at the Justice Department is you have a lot of people who have resigned, but you also have a lot of heads of departments who haven't been confirmed. So it's a little unusual in that sense. But Noel Francisco is the one who would be expected to take this over. There is also, though,
he's been confirmed.
He has been confirmed. He's quite a character, a brilliant